Verse 5 says, "But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he?" I'm speaking in human terms. "May it never be. For otherwise, how will God judge the world?" This is a kind of a sarcastic comment by Paul. If our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? So in other words, if my sin shows that God is righteous for judging me for it, therefore my sin does something good for God because he proves how unrighteous I am, then how is it fair that God judges me for it? Paul's opponents here are arguing against Paul's teaching that we are justified by God's grace, which is received through faith. Paul answers that charge that God can't judge us for being unrighteous if our sin shows him to be righteous, both with scripture and logic. Adding, for otherwise, how will God judge the world? If God is God, then God is the judge of the world. So if God could not judge sin, he would not be God. Which makes their argument kind of weird. Verse 5 connects to the previous verse, which quotes Psalm 51, written by King David after he sinned with Bathsheba. Remember that one? Yeah. Yeah. Now, for those of you who are kind of vaguely, the sin of Bathsheba, there's a whole lot to that story. I mean, there's the seeing him seeing her from the rooftop. Shouldn't have been looking. He should have just said, "Oh, that's not mine," and gone back inside. But he didn't. And then he sent for her. And then he slept with her. And then once the child was born, he's like, okay, rather than say, "Uriah, you and I need to have a discussion," he's like, "Uriah, you should come home." Now, I don't know how much you remember about Uriah, but when David and Saul were fighting, Uriah was one of the mighty men that would go out. He was one of the heroes of David. He was one of the leaders. He's like one of the guys. And David's answer, after he had not just betrayed Uriah's trust by sleeping with his wife, his answer was to try to bribe him to sleep with his own wife. And he's like, "Listen, I should be back at the front. I'm doing good things there." Then sent him out to be killed. So David's a murderer, he's a liar, he's an adulterer, on several levels. So that's where he's at. Now, we're at the point after Nathan, the prophet Nathan, has come to David and said, "This is what you've done wrong." David admits that he's wrong. Keep in mind that David was listed as a man after God's own heart. So now when I look at myself and I'm like, well, I've got these problems. Okay, David was listed as a man after God's own heart. He was a liar, he was a cheat, he was a thief, he was a murderer, he was an adulterer, and he was listed as a man after God's own heart. So if that man can be loved by God, maybe there's a chance for me.